You are looking at becoming better at Trackmania, and I'm here to help you. And in this video, we will go through all the basics to get you started. I do want to start off with one question though. How long have you played Trackmania? I'm very curious about the audience of these videos, so do help me out and answer in the comments. But let's just begin by talking about the most common question I get: controller or keyboard? You might be inclined to say that controllers are always better for racing games, but what if I said that's not necessarily true? The main difference comes down to analog versus digital input, and being able to do precise steering is advantageous in some areas, such as precision maps, but doing digital inputs is beneficial in other areas, such as flat ice terrain. So you might ask yourself, well, what does the pros use? In competitive play, the controller is most prominent, but there are pros who still currently use the keyboard, and even one pro that uses steering wheel, which is incredible, by the way. So I recommend trying out both options, see which one you enjoy the most, and then practice with that. But regardless of which peripheral you use, there are some similar tips that I need to give you. During gameplay, you will need to be able to accelerate, brake, and steer at the same time. If you don't do this already, you should start practicing right now because it's super important. This is easy to do on a controller, but on a keyboard, this can be a challenge if you only use W, A, S, and D or only use the arrow keys. Therefore, you should consider rebinding the brake key to something your other hand can press, like Control or Shift. But then you can ask yourself, well, are controller players all good then? Do they need to rebind? And yes, absolutely they do. For instance, the only analog input in the game is steering. Acceleration and braking are always digital, so using the default back triggers is necessary. For example, I personally use X and square buttons on my controller to accelerate and brake. And before you ask, I use a PlayStation 5 controller, but any controller or keyboard will be fine. But if you do choose to use the triggers, the car will only start accelerating halfway through the button press, and it can result in less precise inputs for you. But I did say that steering is still analog. Wouldn't this give controller players like a huge advantage? And as it turns out, the developers have already thought about this and introduced mechanics to try to even out the playing field. So, introducing action keys. So both keyboard and controller players can utilize an in-game mechanic called action keys. They're located in the keybinds menu, and they will help you with precision steering. This is especially useful for you keyboard players out there. So what do these action keys actually do? Well, they limit the steering your car can do, and it increases in increments of 20%. So action key 1 lets you steer at 20%, action key 2 is 40%, 3 is 60%, and so on. And if you activate a specific action key, you can press the same one again to deactivate it. These action keys have played a crucial role in the history of past Trackmania records since its inception. The first main application of action keys was on the dirt surface. Here it's optimal to avoid sliding if you're below 3rd gear. I will get into the gear mechanics and technicalities in a future episode, but it is easy to drift accidentally, especially on a keyboard. If you don't tap steer fast enough, your car will enter a slide. With the introduction of action keys, the players can just press a button and full steer to avoid sliding out. Now, this was first met with much controversy, but has slowly been accepted by the community. Now, on a keyboard, you have limitless keys to bind the action keys to, but on a controller, you are a bit more limited. I unbind and rebind specific action keys depending on the map that I play to be able to either optimize my time or become more consistent. I only have 2 action keys bound at any time, so I choose wisely, and mine are bound to the R2 and L2 triggers. With your new action keys properly bound, we only need one more mechanic to bind, and that is the camera angles. So there are 3 different camera angles that each have their own alternate mode. I won't talk too much about these extra modes as they usually don't get too much attention. Camera 1 is a broad overhead view, and this is an excellent standard view, and many players choose to utilize this as their base camera, me included. But if you do not want that, you still need to bind it, at least on some of the ice maps where it's the easiest camera to work with. Camera 2 follows the car more closely, and it tilts with the car's tilt. Many players also utilize this camera as their primary camera, but some others find it dizzying or disorientating. Camera 2 excels at maps with many sloped surfaces, as camera 1 sometimes will clip behind surfaces when met with maps like this. Now, there is no definitive best camera to use as your standard camera between these two, so pick whichever one you enjoy the most. But camera 1 is the best one, prove me wrong in the comments. Camera 3 is the cockpit view. You'll often get forced into this view when playing maps that include wall rides, loops, or other fun shenanigans. Not a lot of players use this camera as their standard, but they do exist. In fact, the 5-time world champion Carl Jr. uses the alternate version of this camera where you get placed on the ground without the car visible. How you learn to drive like this is beyond me, but Carl makes it work enough to be the reigning world champion. There is one bonus camera, and that is camera 7, also known as the free cam. Press this camera and use the WASD or the arrow keys to move around and click and drag to look around. This is very useful if you're playing a pathfinding map, looking for Easter eggs, or just generally want to examine a map. With that being said, more episodes are coming, so if you enjoyed or learned anything, subscribe for future episodes. My Patreon sponsored this episode, all 3 of them. Thank you guys. If you want to support me in episodes like this, please head to the Patreon and check it out. And if you're looking for other Trackmania videos, you could check this one out. It seems pretty good. See you guys in the next one.